Laughter stung like acid on his calloused hands. Robert hunched over blueprints as jeers echoed through the garage, each snicker driving him deeper into doubt. "Single dad mechanic" was laughed at became his silent mantra, a wound reopened daily. Yet in his cramped shed, impossible geometries took flight. His son's eyes reflected what others couldn't see: possibility. The jet would fly without a pilot, and with it, his vindicated heart. Robert wiped grease from his weathered hands, the blackened rag a stark contrast to the pristine white blueprints spread across his workbench. The fluorescent lights of Denver Auto flickered overhead, casting alternating shadows and harsh illumination across the detailed schematics he'd hastily covered when Todd from the front office had sauntered over. His co-workers' laughter still rang in his ears from that morning's ridicule. The words "Rocket Man" and "Professor Crazy" lobbed across the garage like wrenches into his already fragile sense of self-worth. The mockery had become ritual, as predictable as the Colorado sunrise that would stream through the high windows tomorrow, revealing another day of the same torment, the same disbelief, the same quiet determination to prove them all monumentally wrong. The clock on the wall ticked past 7, reminding Robert he was already late to pick up Lucas from his after-school program. Another black mark his ex-wife would surely add to her growing list of parental failures. He carefully rolled the blueprints, sliding them into the weathered cardboard tube that had become both his treasure chest and his burden, a repository of dreams his colleagues would never understand, and his ex-wife had long ago dismissed as the fantasies of a man who couldn't accept his station in life. The tube slipped into his locker, hidden behind the mundane armor of his everyday existence: a faded Denver Broncos jacket, a lunch pail with yesterday's sandwich still inside, and a framed photo of Lucas on his 10th birthday. Gap-toothed smile beaming with a pride that had begun to waver in recent years, as the chasm between father and son slowly widened with each missed baseball game and each distracted conversation over dinner. The drive home in his battered pickup truck was a meditation of sorts, the familiar potholes and turns giving his mind freedom to soar where his body could not, mapping airflow patterns and calculating thrust-to-weight ratios that most mechanics with his limited formal education shouldn't comprehend. Each red light was a pause to reconsider a control surface design, each green an acceleration toward the possibility that the autonomous navigation system he'd coded during midnight hours might actually work when tested against real-world variables. The radio played softly in the background, some pop song Lucas had programmed into the presets, a constant reminder that despite his obsession with flight, Robert remained tethered to Earth by the most powerful force he'd ever known: his love for his son and the fear that he was failing him with every passing day. With every hour spent in the shed behind their modest rental house, instead of helping with homework or attending parent-teacher conferences. Lucas was waiting on the steps of the community center, shoulders hunched against the crisp autumn air, his 14-year-old frame somehow both gangly and imposing, caught in that mysterious transformation from boy to young man that seemed to have happened while Robert was lost in calculations and welding. The boy climbed into the truck without a word. The silence between them waited with unasked questions and unexpressed concerns, the invisible barrier that had formed gradually, like frost creeping across a windshield. Robert wanted to tell him about the breakthrough he'd had with the gyroscopic stabilization system, how the miniature prototype had hovered perfectly for 30 seconds in the shed that morning before dawn. But he swallowed the words, knowing they would only reinforce his ex-wife's narrative that he prioritized tinker toys over parental responsibilities, that his dreams were stealing precious time from his son's childhood, time that was slipping away like smoke from an exhaust pipe. The microwave dinner spun slowly on the turntable, casting hypnotic shadows across the kitchen, as Lucas silently worked on algebra homework at the small table they shared for meals and school projects, and occasionally, For the rare moments when Robert would share small, carefully selected details about his autonomous aircraft. Tonight would not be one of those nights. The text message from his ex-wife still burned in his pocket, threatening another custody evaluation if he couldn't get his head out of the clouds and focus on providing stability for their son. The irony wasn't lost on Robert, that his pursuit of flight had grounded him in a daily reality of fear and inadequacy, that his vision of technological freedom had become a prison of secrecy and shame, that the very people who should believe in him the most were the ones who believed in him the least, leaving only his own stubborn conviction to fuel his continued work on a project that might never see the light of day, might never soar through the azure Colorado skies as he had dreamed it would for so many sleepless, solitary nights. When Lucas finally spoke, pushing away his half-eaten lasagna with disinterest, his words cut through Robert's thoughts with surgical precision. "Mom says you're going to lose your job if you keep working on your project at the garage," he said, making air quotes with fingers still marked with the blue ink of school assignments and the yellow calluses of a budding guitarist. "She says we'll have to move in with Grandma if that happens, and I'll have to change schools again." The accusation hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable, that Robert's pursuit was selfish, that his dream was coming at a cost neither of them could afford to pay, that the wings he was building in secret might actually be anchors, dragging them both down into deeper waters of financial instability and emotional distance, waters that threatened to drown the fragile relationship that was all they had left of what had once been a family. The shed behind Robert's rental house stood like a sentinel in the moonlight, its weathered wooden walls containing more than tools and parts. They held the physical manifestation of his defiance against a world determined to keep him firmly on the ground. Inside, illuminated by a single overhead bulb and a series of strategically placed work lights, the prototype sat on a makeshift platform, its sleek, unconventional design a stark contrast to the cluttered workbenches and oil-stained concrete floor. The autonomous jet was small, roughly the size of a coffee table, but in its carbon fiber curves and meticulously crafted control surfaces lay the culmination of 5 years of research, trial, error, and the stubborn refusal to accept the limitations others had placed upon a man with grease-stained hands and a high school diploma collecting dust in a box under his bed. Robert ran his fingers along the leading edge of the left wing, feeling the imperfections invisible to the eye but obvious to his touch, imperfections that could mean the difference between stable flight and catastrophic failure. The navigation system hummed softly on the bench beside him, a complex array of circuit boards and processors he'd salvaged from discarded electronics and modified beyond recognition, programmed with code he taught himself late at night through free online courses and countless hours of frustrating trial and error. The irony wasn't lost on him. At the garage, he was barely trusted to perform complex engine diagnostics on luxury vehicles, yet here, in this humble shed, he had created an artificial intelligence capable of making thousands of flight adjustments per second, an autonomous brain that could potentially outperform human pilots in reaction time and precision, if only he could perfect the integration between software and hardware, between digital commands and physical response. The sound of the back door opening sent a jolt of panic through his system, his hands instinctively moving to cover the prototype with the tarp he kept nearby for unexpected visitors. But it was Lucas who appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the kitchen, his lanky teenage frame hesitant at the threshold of his father's sacred space. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice caught in that unpredictable transition between boyhood and maturity, sometimes cracking with the strain of growth and change, much like the prototype that sat half-covered on the workbench. Robert nodded, simultaneously relieved and anxious, watching as his son stepped into the shed with the careful deliberation of someone entering a museum after hours, aware of the precious and fragile nature of what surrounded him, but drawn forward by curiosity that overrode caution. Lucas circled the prototype, hands clasped behind his back, as if to physically restrain himself from touching what he knew was his father's most prized creation. "Is this what they laugh at you for?" he finally asked, his eyes reflecting the soft blue glow of the navigation system's display, his expression unreadable in the shadowed light. "Is this why Mum says you're throwing everything away?" The questions hung in the air like smoke, neither accusation nor endorsement, simply the honest inquiry of a boy trying to understand the forces that had fractured his family, that had turned his father from the superhero of his childhood into this mysterious, distant figure who disappeared into a shed for hours and returned with bloodshot eyes and hands that smelled of solder and dreams too complex for others to comprehend. Robert considered his answer carefully, weighing the burden of truth against the comfort of continued secrecy. This moment felt pivotal, balanced on the edge of a precipice. To include Lucas was to risk disappointing him when failure came, as it had so many times before. To exclude him was to reinforce the growing distance between them, to validate his ex-wife's claims that the project had become more important than parenting. "Yes," he finally admitted, removing the tarp completely to reveal the full glory and terrible vulnerability of his creation. "This is an autonomous aircraft. It flies without a pilot, guided by artificial intelligence I've been developing for years. The guys at work found my designs once when I accidentally left them out during lunch break. They've been calling me Crash and Burn Bobby ever since." The confession brought with it an unexpected sense of relief, as if speaking the words aloud had somehow lightened the weight he carried, had made the project more real and less a fever dream he pursued in isolation. What Robert hadn't expected was the slow smile that spread across Lucas's face, the light of recognition and understanding that dawned in his eyes as he studied the prototype with newfound appreciation. "So it's like those drones we see at the park, but bigger and smarter?" he asked, stepping closer, the initial restraint melting away as fascination took hold. "Can it really fly on its own, without anyone controlling it?" The questions came rapidly now, genuine interest replacing the detached teenage cool Lucas had worn like armor in recent months, and Robert found himself responding with equal enthusiasm, explaining systems and concepts he had never shared with another living soul, watching as his son absorbed complex aerodynamic principles with surprising comprehension, asking questions that revealed an intuitive grasp of engineering concepts Robert himself had struggled to master without formal training. As midnight approached, father and son hunched over the navigation system together, Lucas suggesting a modification to the code that Robert had overlooked, a simple but elegant solution to a processing lag that had been plaguing the system for weeks. Their shoulders touched as they worked, the physical proximity bridging emotional distance that had grown over months of silence and misunderstanding, creating a connection through shared purpose that transcended words. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Robert felt a glimmer of something beyond determination, beyond stubborn defiance. It was hope, fragile but persistent, that perhaps he wasn't crazy after all, that his vision might be validated not just in the eventual flight of his creation, but in the respect he saw dawning in his son's eyes, a respect that no amount of mockery from co-workers or criticism from his ex-wife could diminish. A respect that made him stand taller as they finally closed the shed for the night, walking back to the house together under a canopy of stars that suddenly seemed less distant, less impossible to reach. The morning air carried the distinctive scent of impending snow, that crisp metallic tang that Colorado natives recognized as winter's advance guard. Robert hunched deeper into his worn jacket as he performed the routine maintenance check on a silver Lexus, whose owner complained of a subtle vibration at highway speeds. His mind, however, was miles away, soaring with the modifications he and Lucas had implemented in the navigation system the previous night. Calculations of increased efficiency and response time running like background music beneath the mundane symphony of the garage. The percussive clang of tools against concrete, the rhythmic rumble of hydraulic lifts, the occasional crescendo of engines being tested after repair. He had barely noticed when the garage bay doors opened, admitting not just the bitter morning air, but also the gleaming black Aston Martin that purred to a stop just inside. Its engine note, a sophisticated whisper of power and precision. The woman who emerged from the driver's seat moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention, her tailored charcoal suit and sleek auburn hair marking her as distinctly out of place among the oil stains and pneumatic wrenches of Denver Auto. Robert might not have noticed her at all, lost as he was in thrust calculations, had Todd not whistled low under his breath and announced with theatrical volume, "Looks like we've got a celebrity, boys. That's Sarah Winters from Apex Innovations." The name penetrated Robert's distraction like a tuning fork struck against his consciousness, resonating with recognition. Sarah Winters, the billionaire tech investor whose company had revolutionized everything from medical devices to satellite communications, whose reputation for identifying world-changing technologies before they reached market was legendary in circles far removed from Robert's humble garage, yet whose work he had studied obsessively during his self-education in electronics and artificial intelligence, mining her published papers for insights he could apply to his own creation. Todd was already moving toward her with the eager, slightly predatory smile he reserved for wealthy female customers, but Sarah's gaze had somehow found Robert instead, fixing on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortably aware of the grease stains on his coveralls and the 3-day stubble shadowing his jaw. "Are you Robert Mercer?" she asked, her voice carrying easily across the garage, despite its moderate volume, silencing conversations and causing heads to turn toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to amusement. The question struck him like a physical blow. She knew his name, this woman whose technological innovations he had studied by the light of his laptop while the rest of the world slept, and the realization sent a cold trickle of fear down his spine. Fear that somehow his project had been discovered, that his ex-wife had found a powerful ally in her custody battle, that everything was about to unravel like a poorly secured bolt yielding to persistent vibration. The walk across the garage floor seemed interminable, each step carrying Robert closer to what felt increasingly like Judgment Day, his mind racing through possibilities and finding no plausible explanation for why Sarah Winters would know his name, would seek him out in this unremarkable garage on the outskirts of Denver. When he finally stood before her, he was struck by the clarity of her gaze, the way her eyes seemed to assess and calculate even as her expression remained pleasantly neutral. "Miss Winters," he managed, wiping his hand instinctively on his coverall before realizing the futility of the gesture and awkwardly returning it to his side. "What can I help you with?" The question was standard, mechanical, the default response of a service worker to a customer, but it felt absurdly inadequate in the face of her unexpected presence, like offering a band-aid to treat a seismic event. "Your son contacted me," she replied, the simple statement detonating in Robert's consciousness with the force of high explosives, leaving his thoughts scattered and disorganized. "Lucas sent me an email last night with some very interesting schematics and code snippets. He said I should talk to you about a revolutionary autonomous aircraft you've developed." The garage around them had fallen silent, Robert's co-workers abandoning all pretense of work to witness this surreal interaction. their expressions morphing from initial amusement to confusion to something approaching disbelief as they processed her words. Todd's laugh broke the silence, sharp and dismissive. "Rocket Man, you've got to be kidding. He can barely keep a transmission from slipping gears. Whatever the kid sent you, it's probably something he copied off the internet." The familiar mockery should have stung, as it always did, should have driven Robert deeper into his protective shell of silence and determination. But something had shifted. The presence of Sarah Winters had altered the equation, had introduced a variable that changed everything. Before Robert could respond, could find words to either confirm or deny Lucas's unauthorized sharing of their secret project, the garage door opened again, admitting his son, breathless and wide-eyed, clearly having run from the bus stop after school. "Dad!" Lucas called out, stopping short when he saw Sarah standing there, recognition dawning on his face as he realized his digital message had achieved its intended purpose. "You told her?" Robert asked, his voice low, caught between betrayal and astonishment, struggling to reconcile the secretive boy of recent months with this sudden, bold action. Lucas stepped forward, shoulders squared with a confidence Robert hadn't seen in him since before the divorce, since before life had become a precarious balance of visitation schedules and custody evaluations. "I had to," he said simply. "They need to see what you've created, what we've created." The plural wasn't lost on Robert. Somewhere in the late-night coding sessions and whispered theoretical discussions, the project had transformed from his solitary obsession to their shared vision, a bridge rebuilt between father and son using the materials of dreams and determination. Sarah Winters checked her sleek watch, the gesture decisive rather than impatient. "I have a private airfield 20 minutes from here," she said, as if commenting on the weather rather than making a statement that sent shockwaves through the assembled mechanics. "If what Lucas showed me is even half as functional as it appears, I'd like to see a demonstration today. Now, in fact." The invitation, or command, hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down before Robert and the room of men who had ridiculed him for years, who had dismissed his intelligence and vision as the delusions of a man reaching beyond his station. Robert looked from Sarah to Lucas, seeing in his son's eyes a plea and a promise, then back to his co-workers, their expressions ranging from skeptical smirks to open-mouthed astonishment. In that moment, standing in the center of the garage that had been both his livelihood and his daily humiliation, Robert made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like embracing an inevitable trajectory. Like an aircraft committed to takeoff, there would be no aborting this mission now, no matter how treacherous the air currents ahead might prove to be. The private airfield stretched before them like a concrete promise, its surface unmarked by the commercial clutter of larger airports, its perimeter guarded by the discreet but unmistakable presence of security personnel bearing the Apex Innovations logo on their uniform lapels. Robert's truck seemed painfully out of place among the gleaming vehicles in the small parking area, its rusted fenders and dented tailgate telling the story of a man who fixed luxury cars for others, but could barely maintain his own transportation. The prototype sat secured in the truck bed under a tarp, the culmination of years of work now exposed to scrutiny beyond the protective walls of his shed, beyond the encouraging but untested enthusiasm of his teenage son, about to face the objective judgment of one of the most renowned technical minds in the country. The weight of potential failure pressed down on Robert's shoulders with physical force, bending his posture as he carefully lifted the aircraft from the truck bed, its carbon fiber frame surprisingly light in his calloused hands, yet somehow also unbearably heavy with the freight of hope and fear it carried. Sarah Winters stood at the edge of the runway, the wind playing with loose strands of her auburn hair, her attention focused completely on the device Robert now placed on the smooth concrete surface. "The neural network is adaptive," he explained, his voice steadier than he had expected, finding confidence in the technical details that had consumed his waking hours for years. It doesn't just follow pre-programmed flight paths like commercial drones. It learns from each flight, adjusts for variables in real time, and can navigate complex environments without human input. The words came easier now, technical terms flowing naturally as he detailed the systems that made his creation unique. The proprietary navigation algorithms that could process sensory data 1,000 times faster than existing technology, the innovative propulsion system that allowed for vertical takeoff but transitioned seamlessly to horizontal flight, the self-learning protocols that meant the aircraft actually improved its performance with each operation, refining its responses to atmospheric conditions and optimizing energy consumption without external adjustments. Lucas stood beside them, his eyes darting between his father and Sarah Winters, caught in a strange liminal space between child and conspirator, between student and innovator. When Robert hesitated over a particular technical specification, Lucas supplied it with quiet confidence, earning a raised eyebrow and a praising look from Sarah. "You understand all this?" she asked the boy, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than condescension. Lucas nodded, a flush of pride coloring his cheeks as he elaborated on the coding modifications he had suggested for the gyroscopic stabilization system, his explanation revealing not just rote learning, but true comprehension of the principles involved. Robert watched this exchange with a complex mixture of emotions: pride in his son's obvious intelligence, gratitude for the validation of their shared work, and a twinge of something like grief for all the hours he could have been nurturing this brilliance had he not kept his project so fiercely guarded, had he trusted his son earlier with the vision that had consumed him for so long. The moment of truth arrived with the press of a button on the tablet Robert had connected to the aircraft's onboard systems. There was no dramatic countdown, no theatrical flourish, just a quiet command entered into the interface, followed by the subtle whir of rotors coming to life. The prototype lifted from the concrete with a grace that belied its experimental nature, hovering at knee height as its sensors gathered initial atmospheric data, its processors making thousands of minute adjustments to maintain perfect stability in the gusting Colorado wind. Robert held his breath without realizing it, his entire body tensed for failure, for the crash that had haunted his nightmares and fueled his co-workers' mockery. But the crash didn't come. Instead, the aircraft rose steadily to eye level, then higher, performing a perfect stationary rotation as its systems calibrated and adjusted, the sun glinting off its carbon fiber surfaces as if bestowing a blessing on this mechanical offspring of human ingenuity and stubborn defiance. "Remarkable," Sarah murmured, her professional composure momentarily cracked by genuine wonder as the aircraft transitioned smoothly from hovering to horizontal flight, accelerating down the runway with controlled precision, before executing a banking turn that brought it soaring back over their heads. Robert's tablet displayed a stream of data: altitude, speed, power consumption, atmospheric variables. But he found himself watching the aircraft itself rather than the metrics, transfixed by the physical manifestation of what had lived for so long only in his mind and in crude prototypes that had crashed more often than they had flown. This wasn't just a test flight, it was vindication given wings, proof that the years of sacrifice and ridicule had not been in vain. That the nights spent hunched over circuit boards while his son slept down the hall had been investment rather than neglect. That his ex-wife's dismissal of his hobby as irresponsible fantasy had been profoundly, categorically wrong. The aircraft completed a series of increasingly complex maneuvers, each executed with flawless precision, its autonomous systems responding to changing wind conditions without human intervention. its flight path demonstrating not just the ability to stay airborne, but to navigate with an intelligence that mimicked and in some ways surpassed human pilots. When it finally returned to their position and descended to a perfect landing on the concrete before them, the silence that followed was profound, a reverent hush in the presence of something revolutionary, something that redefined what was possible. Sarah Winters broke the silence first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who recognized a paradigm shift when she witnessed one. "You've done it," she said simply, turning to Robert with new respect in her gaze. "Do you understand what you've created here? This isn't just an advancement in existing technology, it's an entirely new approach to autonomous flight. The applications are virtually limitless." Her words washed over Robert like a cleansing tide, sweeping away years of doubt and defensiveness, of apologetic explanations and dismissed aspirations. Lucas's hand found his father's shoulder, squeezing with unspoken pride and shared triumph, the gesture bridging years of growing distance in a single touch. "I told you, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion poorly disguised as teenage nonchalance. "I told you it would fly." The simple statement carried the weight of restored faith, not just in the project, but in Robert himself, in the father Lucas had begun to doubt, in the dreams he had feared were delusions. As Sarah began outlining possibilities, funding, partnership, development facilities, patent applications, Robert found himself only half listening, his attention captured instead by his son's expression, by the respect and admiration that had replaced the wary confusion of recent months. The autonomous aircraft sat silent now on the runway, its mission complete for the moment, but Robert knew with sudden clarity that its true flight path had only just begun, as had his own journey from ridiculed dreamer to vindicated innovator, from a father losing his son's faith to a man showing that same son the power of perseverance against impossible odds, the tangible proof that some dreams, despite all mockery and doubt, despite all practical obstacles and conventional wisdom, were always meant to soar.